Hello and welcome to the second literary live stream for Soup Inc. There's a little change in lineup from the first time. So we have Orla here, I am here, I'm always here, and Andrew is here. But we have two new members who I'm going to get to introduce themselves now. So
Shotgun
go
up
on ahead.
first.
Oh, Leah, damn. I was going to be cordial. Hello, I'm Luke. I don't really know how to do one of these. I feel like I've just stood up at primary school to introduce myself to the new class. um, I'm Luke. I study with Andrew at Queen's University doing a master's in creative writing. I did 4 years of politics and economics, which was wonderful for my mental health, as you can imagine. And I decided to leave that world because everyone keep asking me if I wanted to be a politician, and my answer was always an emphatic no. So I thought I'd write a lot of literature about, about why I didn't want to be a politician. We'll see more of that in the future. I do some essays which no one sees. I write short stories and poetry, which should have been on the live stream you're watching this evening. So that's me.
Lovely.
Leah, please take it away.
All right, that was a very graceful introduction. I don't know how I'm going to follow that. Hi, my name is Leah Oh. I am a poet writing from London. I grew up in Bath and kind of spent my childhood a little bit between there and visiting my mum's family in Malaysia. I'm struggling to admit that I write poetry and I don't like showing anyone, so this is a very painful process, but it's been a lot of fun talking to everyone about it. So yeah, hi.
I'm going to propose this question to both of you, because we talked about this a lot in the last stream, and I am pouncing this upon you. So if you don't have an answer immediately, that's okay. But what do you think are the main things at this point in time that you are thinking about or writing about, or that are coming up in your writing at the moment?
Leah, you can take this one first.
I will, thank you. I'll take the hit. Sorry about that. I think I've really been thinking a lot about like world making endeavors. I've been reading a lot of sci-fi this year, which is, I feel, quite appropriate for a pandemic, going into or coming out of one world state and trying to imagine the place you want to emerge into, and thinking about how, you know, the creativity with which you can imagine a horizon or a future shapes the world you live in. So a lot of that, and then yeah, just a lot of that.
Is that in your poetry as well, Leah?
Yes, but I will not show anyone until it's a little more formed. So not today. This is, I think, a little bit more about imagining how we are being. So
I like that. Okay. I'm actually very similar to Leah in that regard. And that I've been reading a lot of science fiction. I've been writing a lot of science fiction, and I've noticed, like, thematically, my concerns are really about environmentalism at the minute. At least the first few stories that I've written have been, and kind of I try to relate our relationship with nature as it stands to how it might look 50, 100, 150 years from now, because I think we all know it's not exactly trending in the right direction. And as Leah says, it's important to the horizon that you would like to awaken on. I think that was your metaphor. I think it's important to have those sights in mind, but also to know the other direction that it could go in. I'm always hesitant to use the term dystopian, because I don't like to kind of layer those elements in. I'd rather just leave it on like a human level and kind of let the reader be uncomfortable in the world that I've created and know I don't want to live there. There must be something that needs done now to stop us from trending in that direction. And in terms of poetry, my poetry is like completely reserved for like just my own, contemporary emotional struggle. And it doesn't have any lofty ideals or anything. It is just me usually like writing at 2 a.m. and finding a nice, mouthfeel or rhythm or lyricism, I suppose.
2 a.m. is such a great time to write. There's nothing quite like the high of being awake at 2 a.m. and having to get up at 6.
Yeah. It feels cheeky. I feel like a child, like staying up until like Santa comes or something. I'm like, I shouldn't be awake this late.
There's a little demon in me that is very tempted to just start this off by saying, hi, I'm Leah and welcome to my blog. But I won't. So, hi, if you just joined, I am Leah. You can find me on Instagram at Wuthering Yikes. And this is my first time reading with Stooping, who are all wonderful, wonderful, lovely, talented friends who are really nice even when the camera's turned off. So that's something. I live and write in London, and I wrote mostly poetry and essay. I'm reading 2 poems today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoy them, and if you don't, please don't tell me. And if you know me in real life and you bully me about this, I will cry instantly. I'm so fragile, so please be warned. Alright, here goes. These days, we live against the frustration of no doors. Far away at breakfast, I was having a conversation with my mother, asked her, what do you think of when you think of the world? The world itself is a trick question with no good answer. People, Peter, planetary, are only aspects. The world slips away from hands. It is burdened into place by our feet, which we take in turns to lift. The only way to hold the world is in the mouth. What I mean to get across is, totality is staggeringly heavy, like implication. Notes on Invention and Spacetime, a poem for Kay. In our isolation, we are inventing ways of being adjacently, hinge clasping 2 continents at the borders of a map, guttural distance collapsed into infancy. This is how it was when Ada Lovelace made real her analytical engine, blasting instants into new increments of time, or when Hedy Lamarr ripped signals across radio frequencies, scattered, static, synchronicity, wireless. What I'm trying to say about the nature of invention is not progress, but secretion, worlds out of the gulf of an eye. In this moment of being adjacently, you, in quantum terms, distance makes a wide net of now, I think, antiquity, subtle bodies sunk in symmetry, interplanetary, our arms unfolding. You. There are more things going on than fall under the category of real. You said, my brain is a scrambled egg, entangled in the schema we crouch, surveying a globe, all wall and eggshell. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope you are having a lovely evening. I hope you're excited for what you've heard and what you hear, and take care, stay safe, enjoy life somehow if you can, how you can. Goodbye.
Café du Néant by Mina Loy. Little tapers leaning, lighted diagonally, stuck in coffin tables of the Café du Néant, leaning to the breath of baited bodies, like young poplars fringing the Loire. Eyes that are full of love and eyes that are full of coal, projecting light across the fulsome ambient, trailing the rest of the animal behind them, telling of tales without words and lies of no consequence one way or another. The young lovers hermetically buttoned up in black, to black cravat, to the blue powder edge dusting the yellow throat. What colour could have been your bodies when last you put them away? Nostalgic youth, holding your mistress's pricked finger in the indifferent flame of the taper, synthetic symbol of life in this factitious chamber of death. The woman, as usual, is smiling as bravely as is given to her to be brave. while the brandy cherries in winking glasses are decomposing harmoniously with the flesh of spectators at a given spot. There is one who, having the concentric lighting focused precisely on her, prophetically blossoms in perfect putrefaction. Yet there are cabs outside the door. Marie, by Lola Ridge. Marie's face is a weathered sign to the palace of gliding cars, over the bend where the trolley dips, a dime for a wired rose, nickel a ride to the zigzag stars, and then men in elegant clothes that feed you on cardboard ships, and the sea floats so fine, like a green and gorgeous bubble God blew out of his lips. When Marie carries down the stair the ritual of her face, your greeting takes her unaware, and her glance is timid bold, as a dog's unsure of its place, with that hair of the rubbed-off gold and a wedding ring worn to a thread in a halo about the head. And those luminous eyes in their rims of paint, she looks like a bedizened saint. But when the worn moon, like a face still beautiful, wavers above the battery, and light comes in, mauve-grey, squeezing through shutters of furnished rooms till only corner holds spots of darkness, as a tablecloth its purple stains when a festival is ended, then Marie creeps into the house. The paint is lonesome on her cheek. The paint is gone from off her mouth, that curls black loosely from her teeth. She pushes slackly at the dawn that crawls upon the yellow blind, and enters like an aimless moth, whose dim wings hover and alight upon the blurred face of a clock, or on the pallor of her feet, or anything that's white, until dispersed upon the sheet, all limp, her waxen body lies, in its delinquent grace, like a warm bent candle that fleers about its place. Bath, by Amy Lowell. The day is fresh washed and fair, and there is a smell of tulips and narcissus in the air. The sunshine pours in at the bathroom window and bores through the water in the bathtub in lathes and planes of greenish white. It cleaves the water into floors like a jewel and cracks it to bright light. Little spots of sunshine lie on the surface of the water and dance, and their reflections wobble deliciously over the ceiling. A stir of my fingers sets them whirring, reeling. I move a foot and the planes of light in the water jar. I lie back and laugh, and let the green-white water, the sun-floored beryl water, flow over me. The day is almost too bright to bear, and the green water covers me from the too bright day. I will lie here a while and play with the water and the sunspots. The sky is blue and high. A crow flaps by the window, and there is a whiff of tulips and narcissus in the air.
Days when there's been something in the news that just occupies my mind until 10 o'clock at night, I'll still stew with it for a couple hours and then start writing like a really obnoxious diatribe that before long just turns into a poem. And I'm like, okay, I'm done with that now. I know what emotion I'm going for. I'm going to just write a little poem here. And then I'll be like, finally, good. And then edit it in the morning because I'm clearly in no state of mind to be doing anything actually productive.
And this is a really good segue to go into what we're actually planning to talk about for our conversation. See,
well done, Liz.
how we set that up.
Brilliant.
So
Brexit.
Watching the news. And we're going to talk about editing, and I myself have a very interesting relationship with editing. I'm trying to learn how to do it for the first time. I'm trying to learn how to go back to stuff that I'd written previously and change it without it feeling like I'm cutting off body parts. And I think something that it's an interesting thing to do. Usually whenever I'm writing, I like to do it all at once to get it all out and then close the door and never look at it again. But in the past sort of year or so, in sort of showing people my work, I've realized that that isn't quite the way to do it. And sometimes whenever you go back with a different mindset or fresh eyes, or it's a different type of light outside, the meaning can change and what you're trying to say doesn't actually come across. And it's knowing it in your head and trying to put it on the page. So something that I have been trying to do is go back to stuff and completely dissect it and sort of wait until like the body's cold and then just take all the parts and then try and make something new. And I think it is very difficult to do that. And whenever I was younger and whenever I was writing stuff that I wasn't showing anyone, I edited it as I was writing my first draft. And then that was that, and that was the end of it. I put it away, and that's why I wrote 10,000 word short stories, which aren't quite short, but aren't quite long enough. And since then, trying to like work within word limits and form limits and stuff is challenging and is making me question everything I know about myself as a writer, and also making me question what is good and how to make something good, and how to, like, I've been really interested in shorter sentences recently. I used to write huge floral paragraphs. I've talked about this before, and then not being able to cope with cutting it down. Now I love a full stop. I love like shorter sentences. But yeah, I wanted to ask all of you whether your relationship with editing has changed, whether you enjoy editing. And some people love the editing process.
I really love editing, and like, I'm gonna come in because I feel like that's a rogue shout. It's a little bit left field.
You came in hard on that one.
Well, I feel like, because I never used to like editing at all, and I feel like there is something like, generally editing is not, I prefer editing other people's stuff because I feel less like attached to it. I like I did some comments on story for Luke like a week ago, maybe.
Brilliant as well, yeah.
Which like, and I don't know how Luke can attest to whether or not they're actually coherent or helpful, but I love doing it. I think a lot of it, what I've realized particularly, and I think I've started to enjoy editing mostly because I've had to edit stuff, because either I'm showing people and therefore more stressed about it, or because like even just through doing like my undergraduate and now my master's, like when I wrote my dissertation, I realized that I actually really had to edit it and really had to like mess about with how things sort of sat in it. And actually, as soon as I got into that, I started enjoying it a lot more. And I think that's meant that sort of crossed over into my other work as well, and my more creative stuff. But I think I've realized that because art is very subjective, and like there's loads of poetry that I really hate, and that doesn't mean it's bad poetry. Like, Seamus Heaney won a Nobel Prize. Is he my favorite poet? No, I'm sorry, he's not. So I'm gonna get absolutely hounded for that.
Are we getting to the annoying part of the podcast? You know who I hate.
Honestly, I'm terrible for this. But like, obviously he won a Nobel Prize, so there's some good stuff in it.
I love Seamus Heaney. I want that on the internet.
Yeah, absolutely love Seamus Heaney.
Yeah.
I'm with it.
I actually have a tattoo of, I'm joking, but imagine if I did.
We're a diverse group, we've got many interests.
Yeah, some of us like Seamus Heaney, some of us don't. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
But I think like part of editing is going, well, and especially for editing for other people, I've really realized something that I think something needs might not be what they think it needs, or what a different reader might. But that's also sort of, that's their prerogative to decide, oh, okay, well, I like this thing that someone else is bringing, because that's why you get other people to edit stuff for you, because they might have a different perspective. So it's sort of, and with my own stuff, I've started going, well, actually, I just have to sort of go with what I like and what I think, and trust my own judgment on that. And that means that I think I've got much more into the editing process. I don't delete drafts. I will say that. I don't know. I wonder if I might be able to show you.
So what does that mean? Say you'll. Oh, okay, yeah, show us. Yeah.
I'm gonna see if I've got. I have like a million notebooks, so I'm gonna. Okay. So I'm trying to see if I've got like the same poem that I could show. Basically, so I write a lot like this. It's going to be backwards. Oh no. There we go.
Do the thing with your hand.
Abilene. So like I write, it's better back here. And then, so this will be like, I actually didn't redraft that one, but so like I'll like write one like here, and then like I don't know, like 5 pages later, amidst all my other random scribbling, like I'll take the idea and write something else about it, or like, so I have all of my drafts in paper copies in notebooks that I can flick through.
Do you write with paper and pen?
Yeah, I type things up because otherwise I lose them. So when I think I'm like settled on a draft and probably won't touch it again for a while, I'll type it so that I can then find it again at a later date. Because otherwise I have all these like numbered notebooks. But they are. Oh, this is one that I actually did.
That's so interesting.
So this is
remember them, and also like how writing things on paper locks you into kind of a temporal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's quite well because like quite often that's like that was my first completed notebook. My one at the minute is a bit more, it's kind of like slapdash. It's got loads of different things in it. But I also it's really exciting actually. I really like this one. It's a new way of writing on stuff. But so because I also write down, you can't really see on this one, I write down like random phrases and stuff. So as part of my writing, I'll be like, oh, I'm reading this essay about Yeats. I really like that sentence. I'll put that in somewhere and come back to it. But so that sort of works in with my editing, in that I have all of these like paper copies of stuff, and then I'll be like flicking through them and sort of rewriting, and then I'll write it. Sometimes I decide I need to write it on a big piece of paper, so I have like an A4 notebook that I use for that, and then I've got and I think, I mean, I'm very visual, so I need to write things down and do it like that. But I find that helps with editing, just writing it out so many times, and you see which lines you don't like or which words don't quite fit, and
see, that's the opposite for me, is when I like repeat, if I like write and like rewrite or re-edit or reread, I find that, especially if I'm reading out loud, it kind of adopts a certain comfortability in my mouth, and then I'm used to it, and it makes it almost more difficult for me to edit what I've written, because I'm almost automatically just like regurgitating what's on the page. Well, that's usually when I'll turn to someone and be like, please, for the love of God, read this, because I'm too familiar with my own words.
As in the thing has become so cemented that like you can't change it now. It is that already. Yeah.
And I think I shoot myself in the foot a little bit by writing like, I don't want to say like lyrically, but I don't know if that's fair to say, mainly because I don't have any expertise in actually doing that, but I tend to, like, make it kind of lyrical or lilting to my own voice, and therefore it just feels like a natural sentence for me to have written, even though it could not make any sense. But in my mouth, it's just familiar, and it makes sense because even if I haven't put it on the page, it's in my head.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the repetition of it sets it in stone almost. Yeah.
Even if it's a massively floral paragraph with 40 commas in one period, like just nonsense.
I think voice is a very like interesting thing, like in terms of that as well, because obviously like people say things differently, and I always find like writers with different accents write very differently. So if I'm reading like poetry from Belfast, like it reads in a Belfast accent, which makes it very different, I think, editing and even getting other people to edit.
Yeah, for sure. I like what you said about editing other people's work is so fun. For me, whether it's poetry or prose or whatever, I hadn't really done it until maybe in the last year or so, and it's so fun, and you can, I am often so much more compassionate when I'm editing other people's work than my own. So in that regard, when I am editing my own work, I have come back to, I wasn't doing this for a long time, but I have decided that track changes is my best friend, because you can, come to things with a knife and kind of like cut it up and go way too far in what you've deleted. And it's fine, because you can just, you can come back a day later and be like, actually, that's not terrible. Or, there are redeemable elements of that. But so you said, Orla, you talked about keeping drafts. Would you like as the thing goes along, would you have like several versions of a document on?
No, so I
No.
tend to. I have like, I'm such a sucker for paper copies. Like,
Right.
so I will, when I think that I've completed a draft, I'll like write it up nicely, like without all my scribbles and corrections over it. So I'll have it
Okay.
in one of my notebooks somewhere. And then I'll usually like type up a version that I'm pretty happy with. But I have gone back and edited, like when I've then re-edited something on a paper copy, I'll update my computer copy.
Yeah.
So I've got all of them on paper, but then my computer ones are usually like
The
the
most
latest.
up-to-date version.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
See, I've probably relied on. I always find it like in terms of keeping up with, like if I'm trying to get a story out, trying to get to the end of the story, especially, like anything else would be too slow. I think like I like to. The screen is like a fast way to, or it's just so immediate. But starting to wonder maybe if I should spend more time on paper, or like some time on paper at least, just for the bare, for the basic
I mean,
ideas.
notably, like I only really have been writing poetry recently, so poetry is much easier. Like it's much easier to like sit and write out and redraft and like write like bits of poems, because obviously they're significantly shorter. And also I think for me, and with poetry, because of the layout of it, and the layout is such a, but the form of it is such a thing, being able to write that out and play about with it more freely on a page. So I also like unlined notebooks, because I can mess about a bit more with the way that I'm sort of presenting it. But I don't know if that would work. Like when I write essays, obviously I do that on the computer, and then I would track changes and go through it like that probably. And I would have multiple versions of essays when I do those editing online.
Hiya. Today I'm going to read a couple of extracts from John McGahern's That They May Face the Rising Sun, which is a novel set in the Lakelands of Leitrim in the northwest Midlands of Ireland. So this is starting from page 1. The morning was clear. There was no wind on the lake. There was also a great stillness. When the bells rang out for Mass, the strokes trembling on the water, they had the entire world to themselves. The doors of the house were open. Jamesy entered without knocking and came in noiselessly until he stood in the doorway of the large room where the Rutledges were sitting. He stood as still as if waiting under trees for returning wildfowl. He expected his discovery to be quick. There would be a cry of surprise and reproach. He would counter by accusing them of not being watchful enough. There would be welcome and laughter. When the Rutledges continued to converse calmly about a visit they were expecting that same afternoon, he could contain himself no longer. Such was his continual expectation of discovery that in his eavesdropping he was nearly always disappointed by the innocence he came upon. "Hello, hello, hello," he called out softly, in some exasperation. "Jamesy." They turned to the voice with great friendliness. As he often stole silently in, they showed no surprise. "You are welcome. Ye are no good. I have been standing here for several minutes, and haven't heard a bad word said about anybody yet. Not a bad word," he repeated, with mocking slowness as he came forward. "We never speak badly about people. It's too dangerous. It can get you into trouble. Then you never speak, or if you do, the pair of yous are not worth listening to." In his dark Sunday suit, white shirt, red tie, polished black shoes, the fine silver hair brushed back from the high forehead, and sharp, clean features, he was shining and handsome. An intense vividness and sweetness of nature showed in every quick, expressive movement. Kate. He held out an enormous hand. She pretended to be afraid, to trust her hand to such strength. It was a game he played regularly. For him, all forms of social intercourse were merely different kinds of play. God hates a coward, Kate, he demanded, and she took his hand. Not until she cried, Easy there, Jamesy, did he release his gently tightening grip with a low crow of triumph. You are one of God's troopers, Kate. Mr. Rutledge, he bowed solemnly. Mr. Murphy? No misters here, he protested. No misters in this part of the world. Nothing but broken down gentlemen. There are no misters in this house either. He that is down can fear no fall. Why don't you go to mass then, if you're that low? Jamesy changed the attack lightly. What's that got to do with it? You'd be like everyone else round here by now if you went to mass. I'd like to attend mass. I miss going. What's keeping you then? I don't believe. I don't believe, he mimicked. None of us believes and we go. That's no bar. I'd feel a hypocrite. Why do you go if you don't believe? To look at the girls. To see the whole performance, he cried out and started to shake with laughter. We go to see all the other hypocrites. Kate, what do you think about all this? You've hardly said a word. My parents were atheists, Kate said. They thought that all that exists is what you see. All that you are is what you think and appear to be. Give them no heed, Kate, he counselled gently. You are what you are, and to hell with the begrudgers. The way we perceive ourselves and how we are perceived are often very different, Rutledge said. Pay no heed to him either. He's just trying to twist and turn. Thought pissed in the bed and thought he was sweating. His wife thought otherwise. You'll get on good as any of them, Kate. He took pruning shears from his pocket and placed them on the table. Thanks, he said. They were a great comfort. Pure Sheffield. Great steel. I bought them from a stall in the Enniskillen market one Thursday. They weren't expensive. The North. He raised his hands for emphasis. The North is a great place for bargains. Would you like a whiskey, Jamesy? She asked. Now you're talking, Kate. But you should know by now that will ye is a very bad word. Why bad? Look at your man. He pointed to where Rutledge had already taken glasses and a bottle of Powers from the cupboard and was running water into a brown jug. I'm slow. You're not one bit slow, Kate. You just weren't brought up here. You nearly have to be born in a place to know what's going on and what to do. He wasn't brought up here. Not too far off. Near enough to know. He wasn't at school, but he met the scholars. Good health. And more again tomorrow, he raised his glass. The crowd lying below in Strahan aren't drinking any drinks today. Good luck. What's the news? No news. Come looking for news, he cried ritually, and then could contain his news no longer. Johnny's coming home from England. He's coming home this Tuesday. Mary got the letter. Yeah. There's another little piece here as well I'm going to add on. So this is much later, probably about a year later. September and October were lovely months. The summer ended, winter not yet in. The cattle and sheep were still out on grass, the leaves turning. The little vetch pods on the banks turned black. Along the shore a blue bloom came on the sloes. The blackberries moulded and went unpicked. The briar leaves changed into browns and reds and yellows in the low hedges, against which the pheasant could walk unnoticed. Plums and apples and pears were picked and stored or given around to neighbours or made into preserves in the big brass pot. Honey was taken from the hives. The bees fed melted sugar. For a few brilliant days, the rowan berries were a shining red-orange in the light from the water, and then each tree became a noisy infestation of small birds as it trembled with greedy clamouring life until it was stripped clean. Jamesy arrived with sacks of vegetables and was given whatever he would take in return. When the All-Ireland finals in Croke Park were live on television, Rutledge walked round the lake to watch the match with Jamesy. Jamesy poured whiskey and Mary made tea and sandwiches. The irregular striking of the clocks from every quarter of the house throughout the match served as a cool corrective to the excited commentary. The team Jamesy supported nearly always won. His support completely based on which of the teams he thought most likely to win and provide a triumphant, satisfying end to the year. Once they lost, it was as if his judgment had been impugned. No use, he thrust out his hands. They should have been ashamed to turn out. It wasn't even worth looking at. When the match ended and was talked over for a while, Rutledge and Jamesy, accompanied by the two dogs, walked out to the lake. Thanks for the game. It was great fun. The right team won this year anyway, he remarked complacently. We'll watch it again next year. With the help of God, Jamesy said firmly as they separated. The shore was dry, the fallen leaves rustling against his tread. Not until he reached the alder at the gate did he see the Mercedes stationed in front of the porch. Once he entered the house, he could hear his uncle chatting happily with Kate. Will he be able for it, Kate? That's the 6 marker.
Oh my god, when you said we were going to talk about editing, I started writing a bunch of I freaked out and I started writing a bunch of just fictional editing practices, not to lie about, which is what it sounds like, but just like for fun, because I was like, just carve your entire manuscript out on a rock and just wait and see what nature wrecks upon it. And then I remembered my own editing practice, which was like my very unhealthy editing practice, which is to just keep opening new Word documents on my computer into the 10s, into the 20s, and wait until my computer would crash and start all over again from the wreckage. It's disgusting.
So you'll like copy and paste the whole thing into a new doc. Like say if you've got a thing going and you're like, okay, I'm going to do another draft of it now. Will you copy and paste it all into another document and chop it up? Or do you mean starting from the blank page each time?
It's just gone. It's gone. I've got no control. I'm at the whim of my janky old computer.
No, not the computer breaking down, but this like 10 drafts. Like say you're on draft 7, you're starting draft 8. Does that mean you open a new document and you start writing it from scratch, or you're copying and pasting it in and hacking at it from there?
I just have the one document, so they'd be like 20 different poems or 20 different things. I just have the one document in kind of like whatever nebulous shape it kind of ended up in. So it's like this constant process of erasure and reinscribing, because I find it quite hard to fix anything in form. Like, how do you guys ever decide when anything's done?
Nothing is ever done.
No.
I don't think anything is. I think deadlines decide,
Abandoned.
like submissions have an impact.
You sort of go, cool, I'm going to have to run with this now. Like, that's fine.
Yeah, I was reading a lot of Frank O'Connor over Christmas, who's like an Irish short story writer from the Southwest. And he infamously like didn't really finish it. Like all of his stories, he was always going back and always like tinkering with them. And I find like, even just before this, I was just bored and looking at some old stories from last year. And I can't get to the end of an old story without changing at least one word. That's fucking stupid.
That.
Like you have to change that. And so it's I don't really know what editing is. And I don't know what a finished document is either.
I always think that so I started publishing poetry this year because I wanted to try and get rejections and get used to getting rejections, and that worked for a while, and then suddenly I started getting poems accepted, which was a nightmare because it meant that I had to be confronted with the idea that I write poetry and that is something that people will read and know me as, whereas have always been like, I'm a short story writer, this is what I am. I don't do anything else, she says, doing a journalism master's, but it's just I have this idea of myself, and it's so bad because I think that as soon as I send a document to someone else, that piece as it is a corpse. Like, I talk about like dead bodies a lot, but that as soon as someone reads it, it's dead, not because that kills it, but just whenever you have it with you, it's still living. And the amount of times I've sent poems off and as a certain version and they've been accepted, and I don't recognize the version that is being published anymore because I've continued to work with the poem. So like there's been times I've had things accepted that have a different name from what I know the poem as now, that have different like number of verses, maybe even have a different like central meaning or central image. I've lost count, like probably every time I've had something accepted, and it really stresses me out because it's not like I'm like the thing that is being represented in this publication is the past. It's not who I am as a writer right now, and I think that's I think the wanting to be seen whenever you have stuff being read by other people and the wanting to be understood properly is more painful whenever the chances of that happening in the first place are so slim, but the fact that the things on the words on the page no longer represent what you want to show to the world with that particular piece of work.
I mean, it's fun that you talk about dead bodies because there's the whole, the author is dead idea that like it doesn't really matter what you think about it once you've sent it, even if it's just sending it to a friend or if it's publishing it properly. Like Nabokov will disagree, or he'll disagree, but you don't really get to tell people what your art is about.
And what I don't know whether I got this from a medley of podcasts or from Dune by Frank Herbert, but I really like the idea that as you've already said, Hannah, a thing is dead once it is certain, once its like meaning is cemented, once it's finalized. That's it. It is dead for all intents and purposes. A piece is only alive when someone can come to it and have their own interpretation of it without. And I guess now I am anti-Nabokov in some degree because pieces live so long as there are living people to read them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I always like when things are unsure as well. Like my least favorite things, like unfortunately some of my most successful and the poems that I'm happiest with, I often like present and people are like, is that about your ex-boyfriend? And I'm like, no, it's not that. It's actually about whatever
it's about
you want
your
it to be.
ex-boyfriend.
exactly. So like, but I much prefer the things that I write and people don't really, that they don't really know what that like how I relate to it.
Yeah,
I find that more interesting, and I'd rather write things like that. So I think I think you're right. I think it's nicer when things are sort of more free in that way.
I really agree. I think there's this massive comfort in like obscurity and in the unknown, because you can go on to be anything and everything is still happening. But if you see something in its totality and if you know it, then where is there to go from there? There's no progression or like no multiplication.
Yeah.
You have to allow yourself to be like, because I think especially when you're writing, the things that you write are always you at that time. So like, I might be a year later editing something that I wrote a year ago, and that's not the same me. But I'm still not trying to edit it to be me now. Like you have to sort of allow these sort of different truths and different sort of possibilities to exist constantly within it, because otherwise everything you'd ever written, you'd be continually trying to make it about you now, which is not how it works. So I think you're right.
If I had to whittle it down, the first thing I remember about you is the wind. The wind and your limp. I was sitting on a bench when you sat down next to me. Bullet holes, you'd said. Now, usually when a stranger comes close to me, I become very still and very self-conscious. I do not invite in meet cutes. You didn't seem to have these boundaries in place. You'd said, I am limping because there are bullet holes in my leg. Then you sat down, and it should have been uncomfortable, but I didn't move. And you told me about your friends who'd been in brawls for simple, honest things like the right to be from where they're from. I knew about that kind of thing already. I am, after all, from where I am from. But it sounded different when you talked about it, like it had more solid ground or deeper roots. Maybe you just had a better speaking voice than I did. Whatever it was enough to make me ask you a question or two. And they were enough that you talked some more about all the stubborn kingdoms from across the sea. After, when I was on the bus home, I leaned my head against the condensation of the window and relaxed my eyes. Behind the fogged up glass, the orange street lamps blurred until they could have been those matchstick soldier men preparing for intersection. We met again when I was older. You picked me up at the bridge and quizzed me to see if I could remember the trivia from our last conversation. I got mostly right answers. It was the end of the summer, and you looked bright in the clouded sunshine. Your limp made you walk slower than I did, so I shortened my own legs with my pace. At one point, you took my hand, and it surprised me how cold your palm felt in the warm afternoon. I'd suggested you put on a jumper. You trailed me through museums and explained history to me in careful rhythmic paragraphs. I listened as much as I could. You frowned when I gathered things from my pockets. A smooth pebble, a crumpled map, a postcard from the gift shop. Why would you buy something like that? You had asked. I didn't know what you meant. It's something a tourist would do. I am a tourist, I'd laughed. I didn't think about you much between our meetings. I liked your stories, but they always felt sturdier than you did. You did not tell me until later that you're as wide as you are tall, and perhaps that is why you seem so heavy. Maybe that is why you always felt far away. Doesn't matter now. And back then, none of this stuff mattered anyway. I had my own forged history, my own familiarity kingdom. I could go up for hours without pausing to think about where I was. I did not ever pack a spare jumper in case it got too cold. I never carried an umbrella because I knew there were enough bus shelters to duck beneath if the drizzle ever turned more threatening. One day without you, when the weather was getting warmer, I put on a jacket from the back of my wardrobe. In the pocket, there was a crumpled map from our last day out. The way it creased reminded me of you. I smoothed the corners and forgot about how you rolled your eyes every time I checked it. And for a brief moment, I missed you. And now I live with you, more out of convenience than anything sentimental. You'd phoned me and said, this opportunity will do you good. I didn't even think about it, I just said yes. I don't think you thought about it either. It is funny how different you look now I'm closer to you. Semi-permanent. You're positively grey. Well, I say closer. I say semi-permanent. We don't spend much time together. I go outside every day. You're like a little dog, you say, when you see me leaving. I used to bring... You don't tell me where the safest places are to walk, so I learn as my feet fall. I used to bring flowers back for you, but they always withered before the end of the week, so I stopped. I buy groceries, and I cook for us and rearrange the crockery cupboards. And you stand in our living room and look at me. At night, I climb into our bed and wait for you to come in and lie beside me. I hear you sometimes, hours after I say I've gone to sleep, creeping into the room. And sometimes I hear you leave the flat without telling me. Every morning you're gone before I wake up, your side of the bed made up and neatly tucked. I eat my breakfasts alone. I never thought it was going to be impassioned. You said you give up those old habits before I walked into your life. Passion along with all that booze and all those cigarettes. I don't think you're telling the truth. When you stay out late, I can smell the gin on your breath, and strange perfumes fill the gaping chasm in the middle of our bed. I spy you smoking one day in your office, arm held loftily out the window. But whenever I suggest wine with dinner, you look confused. I don't drink, you say. One of my friends calls me on the phone. I ran into your grey man, she says. We had coffee. He is a delight. You're so lucky. He knows so much. A flurry from the end of the line blurs out the end of her sentence. Sorry, I missed that. Oh, just me wittering on about how he knows so much about art and music and things that really matter. He doesn't really talk to me about those things, I say. That night, at dinner, you pick at the green bits on the plate. Is it okay, I ask? You don't smile and say yes, which means no. And when you get up to do the dishes, like you do every night, I stop you. You ran into, She said you had coffee? My voice falters before I can turn my statement into a question. Yes, you say. I don't ask any more questions, so you don't say any more either. You just wash the dishes, and I stay sitting down. And then you go out, and I stay sitting down. I float about the flat, in and out of each of the rooms. There's nothing to do. I go into our bedroom and sit on your side of the bed, and there's a pile of books abandoned on the nightstand, desperate and dog-eared. I lift one and begin to read. This sombre routine lasts until November. Then you may as well stop coming back altogether. I start to sleep in the middle of the bed. You just stand in the living room and look at me. There's no more tension or trying. No fables. No badly timed questions. No incorrect answers. I still go for my walks as the world undresses for winter. I stop acting like an appendage faded into the background. I start to greet the friendly faces that pass mine. You wouldn't approve of that, but you're not really here anymore. Besides, the faces sometimes greet mine in return. I like the blue of dry 4 p.m s in November. The blue you can reach out and touch. I reschedule my walks so I come home as the sun comes down, and I hold on in the cold for as long as I can, so that static, half-fleeting delight can dangle in front of my face for the moment between light and dark. I walk in a loop, past the park, up the hill, around the church and back through the park. And when I am luckiest, the park and the blue happen at the same time. One evening, on the news, there's a report about a man grabbing a woman from behind on my street. The footage they show of the man looks just like you. And I cannot believe it. In my head, I see her yell out in fear. I want to run to help, but somebody else already has. He puts his arm out to steady her, helps her gather up her things from the pavement, lets her rest her head against him as he calls for more help. I still walk the same loop, but next time I stop outside the church. I tell myself my hands are cold, and I go inside. I like churches. I know when you don't go to church enough, you're meant to resent them, but I don't. They make me feel safe. The doors are open, and I give a tentative hello to God. It's been a while since we last saw each other. He looks pleased but not surprised to see me. He offers me a seat in the silence which is full and not empty. These things are not the same. There's a woman praying, so I try not to distract her. Instead, I go and stand under the stained glass window. I look at God to compliment them. He is sitting next to the praying lady, but looks up anyway and mouths a thank you. The evening light, not cold but fresh from the inside, spills through the window like a kaleidoscope being cracked open. I respond with spiritual aphasia. I'm like a child. I've never seen anything so beautiful. Did you know the windows change colour depending on the type of light that shines through them? God is standing beside me. He smiles. You should see them on a spring morning. This is pretty good as well, I say. I'm glad you like them. There's a pause when I almost apologise for something, or everything, or nothing. But then he puts his hand on my shoulder and I hold back. I do not have to speak. I do not have to understand. When I leave the church, the praying woman is still sitting there and God is sitting next to her. I go against the grain and walk back the way I came. The sky above me is falling inward, a caved ceiling of cloud. And then there, slipping in under the white wisp, is the moon, chipped and forever in that same spot at this same 4 p.m. I'm shivering, and now my hands really are cold. I shove them into my pockets, and my fingers brush paper. It's your old map. It's even more creased now. I look at it and I think about you. Just a crumpled man in my pocket, always standing there in that same room. I look at the map and know there are no answers. You never really invited me in, and I'd never considered that I did not want you to love me. I walk past the place where the woman got hurt. The street is quiet. I put the map in the bin.
I think there's a weird cross section here with the idea of, and I don't want to derail the train here.
No,
but I think there's an
derail it.
interesting- Oh,
Change the
fantastic.
direction
Well,
of the track.
Then I want to talk about Blade Runner and the million different director's cuts of that film, because I think that's a really interesting, like we've already done it, Hannah, to some degree. You know, you've created a piece and finalized it, and it went to the cinema in 1983, and there was narration, and Harrison Ford's ending was completely different. And then you thought in 2003, oh God, my name is Ridley Scott, and I could make a way better film with the stuff that was left on the cutting room floor. Is there, I guess I'm asking how you guys feel about the death of the art, and whether it's almost like responsible of any of us to take a piece that we finished that's dead and then to reanimate it for our contemporary selves, rather than letting our past selves having had created. I don't think that makes much sense.
Kind of like this cyclical impression of you make something and you go through it and it dies, and then it's dead, but it's also like the start of whatever you're doing next. You're coming from that, you're not leaving it behind. It's going to appear in some way in your later works, and that's a way of it, not necessarily being left behind. The same patterns echo the same poem, but comes up in like many different collections, even if it's a different poem. But I guess like is what you're asking, do you think there's something of ourselves we need to leave behind in these works? Like we're working something out, like we're taking something and putting it somewhere else?
I think, like, I can imagine a lot of stuff that I would have made at the age of 16 that now I might find in a notebook. And, you know, as Andrew says, there's nothing I can read and not fix one word in. But is, like, I guess, do we owe it to that 16-year-old to just leave their work as is, instead of like taking our eyes however many years later and saying, no, they were wrong in this regard. What they should have said was this, and I can fix it, and I can completely almost change the nature of the work from what I'd already made, and whether there's like a responsibility that we have in showing the progression of an artist and just letting a piece exist as it is without attempting to make it better, quote unquote, as we might think it would be.
Yeah.
Multiple drafts.
Multiple drafts.
Yeah.
Spanning decades.
You can go back to notebook number 1 and be like, oh, wow, they wrote this. This is the first draft, huh?
Yeah.
They start having to kick people off the earth because all the material that we've accumulated, all the writing we've accumulated.
It's too much stuff.
See, I think I have a few thoughts about this that all sort of go in different directions and don't really answer your question, but
Perfect.
let's explore that.
I derailed the train. This is exactly
yeah,
what I want.
I'm the contents of the train falling down the hill, and that what I'm going to say. So I think how a poem looks. We use the example of a poem at the moment. Looks how it looks on the page. Is also part of it. If you go back to it and you have a pen that's a different color whenever you're editing it, that doesn't change it but adds to it, in my opinion. And because you can see where the original lines were, and you can see where the original like bones of it were. And I think as writers, it's not just about the writing, and it's not just about the process of writing is as important as what you end up with, and the process of going back and how you interact with your stuff and whether or not that changes or it looks different is also as important as all of it.
I think that's a good point.
And I think that there's there's a part in Angels in America by Tony Kushner, shout out, where there's a line where a character asks a figment of her own imagination, or is it, who's to say, who am I to say, how do people change? And the line is, or the sort of answer is, it's something to do with God, so it's not very nice. God takes a dirty thumbnail and he cuts you open from chin to belly button, and he takes out your guts. He plunges in a great dirty hand and takes your guts and puts them back in again. And it's your job to put yourself together again. It's your job to sew it up, and it's just, you're just mangled guts walking about. And that's how people change over the course of a life. And I think that's kind of like writing. Yeah. You know, it's all just kind of mangled, and it's you're trying to say something. And I guess I've always said that everything I write sounds exactly the same, and everything I write is the same thing over and over again. There are different stories, there are different poems, there's different, you know, plots and characters and different things, but in my head it's all the same thing. And I think that's the thing about writing. You're trying to say one thing or several things that are core to you, and there'll be different things, and there'll be different creative ways to do it, and there'll be different sort of manifestations of those things. But this is why whenever you pick any writer and look at them from a critical lens, there are core arts that you talk about from a critical point of view about them. There are core things that you're like, oh, they wrote about this and this and this and this and this. And it's because I think as people, we are limited by what concerns us, but not limited in how we can express those things. And that's where writing is so important and good. And yeah, that's
Hannah, that was so well expressed.
thank you.
That
Yeah.
was awesome.
Phenomenal.
There's like a tension there that you've actually just nailed, because so one of the things that we read on our course in first term, it's like a Bolaño, is it Arturo Bolaño? He's like a South American writer who was kind of obsessed with obscure artists who didn't really make it, and all his stories are about like people who weren't that famous or whatever. But one of his nice quotes is that if you're writing short stories, you should be writing at least 2 or 3, if not 7 or 8 at a time, because otherwise you're just writing the same story. If you're just writing one, you're just writing the same story over and over and over again. And I've found that like to the extent that like I'll write paragraphs, you know, just in terms of like journaling, you know, journaling-esque kind of meandery, just trying to get words down today. And I'll be like, shit, I have said this exact thing. And I'll, you know, search in my computer and not even just the idea, but the literal words. I said it 7 months ago. You know, so it's getting to the point of boring myself. But yes, so probably everyone is just saying one thing, fine. And whether or not this is related to the next thing, but maybe we hate that about ourselves. So this conversation also made me think of Zadie Smith, who, you know, absolute legend, like really brilliant writer. And I saw in an interview once her and Nick Laird being interviewed, and her talking about she won't go back and read it. Like, she hates her own work. She hates reading her old stuff. She just won't do it. And, you know, the idea of that's like Shakespeare saying, oh, Macbeth was terrible, or, you know, the idea of a really good artist not loving their own work is, I don't know, a bit absurd. And I think that is like relevant to that tension, because you might be looking back and saying, I was chatting shit. You know, it wasn't that interesting.
That's a really interesting question that you're bringing up, because it's kind of from a couple of steps away. Like, how does editing relate to the relationships we have with ourselves if we're editing our own work?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
How does it
yeah, does that permit change, really? Like, if no one was to read your work, I imagine it, like, you would stagnate as an artist very quickly. If that, you know, if you're solely relying on your own ability to criticize yourself either in the past or the present, there's not much room for growth in that, because there's only really one input, and it's your own perception.
You've really just got to wait long enough until you become another person and then come back.
Yeah. And a bit of time is definitely good. Like, I think it's important to leave things for a bit before acting upon them. Like, I have in the past done what you were talking about, Hannah, about like writing a long piece, and except I would just never go back to it. Like, I would have been too mortified, like, you know, read a couple of lines of it and just be, you know, cringed out and no. But like, for a proper editing process, you need to get that distance to become a reader or a rereader. Slightly, yeah, let's take the train. You know, the way we're in the pandemic and it's all like, life is so boring right now, like, unless you're very busy with uni, which some of you are. It's like, for me, I've been finding it a bit stagnant and a bit, you know, just bored with my own thoughts, or bored with my own creativity. How are you guys finding that? And like, do you have ways to get past that, to, you know, to find creativity in the darkness that is the, you know, this January of Januaries?
That's a good question.
Are people finding it like that, or are people finding that they're, you know, just moseying on and doing their own thing? And, you know, I know, Leah, you talked about, you know, getting lost in other universes, and I think that's like a really good thing to do when this universe is so boring right now.
Yeah, I think this is something that might come up a bit in my piece because I'm trying to think about the ways that we can not quite reframe the world, but just how we're in it and our relationship to it. I guess I've been playing like a lot of little word games with myself in my room, and that's been a lot of fun, like just having a glass of wine and making a little table and seeing how I can arrange sentences and just enjoying the play that maybe I wouldn't necessarily indulge in if like the other people were an option, because other people are like the most interesting thing in the world, and
Right.
maybe that's more of an option.
Yeah.
People.
Yeah. So just finding ways to play, just play. Yeah.
Yeah,
I like that.
how do you play with your writing, I guess?
Mhm.
Yeah. God, that is a very good question.
I know
I think
it's hard to do because taking yourself seriously and not taking yourself seriously.
for sure. I like when I find that like when I feel like I'm actually doing it is when it's fun, when it feels like play. But you know, I don't feel like I've played in weeks, like at all.
Mm.
So I've just been reading because I have nothing to say right now. I've just been listening to other people, which is fun, but you know, it's supposed to write.
Reading's such a big part of writing, though.
True.
I haven't, like, over Christmas I wasn't able to read very much for leisure, because I had so many assignments. So it's funny to be at the beginning of a new semester and to be taking this time to start reading for fun, which is just like, it's a recipe for disaster, but not for present me, so it's fine. But like, I just bought lots of books from Abe Books, and they all came in the post like last on Friday, which was really exciting because I love getting post anyway. But to get a bundle of like 4 books was just great.
Love that.
And I actually, this is quite funny that this came up because I felt completely stagnated, and what I'd been doing is I'd actually gone back to a poem that I'd written in like summer and hated, and have completely chopped it up and worked with form. So I just, and see, once something's gone, like as soon as I delete it, it is gone because I write on Google Docs. So it's like away. But I kind of liked the idea of it, but didn't like any of the content. So I started sort of playing with that a little bit. But that is not what I was going to say. So why was I saying it? I listened to Anne Enright's Desert Island Discs last night.
Nice.
And I haven't read any of her stuff. But she lives in Bray, which is not that far from Dublin. And the first weekend that I'd moved to Dublin, I got the bus there and I went on a hike by myself and like paddled in the sea, and it's a lovely place. It's like right very close to like Wicklow. It's like, I think it's just the tip of Wicklow. So you can sort of imagine like what the hills and stuff are like. But
Gorgeous. Yeah.
she's from Dublin and now lives there. So she came into my mind in September and I sort of brushed it away. I hadn't really thought about her, hadn't had time to read about her, and then I was taking a bath. Sorry, but I was like, I want to listen to a podcast in the bath. So and Desert Island Discs is perhaps my favorite. And I was like, oh, there's an Enright, so I put it on, and it's really like nice. She's really like chatty, and I just really enjoyed it. But there's this part where she talks about burnout. So she studied in Trinity, and she was the youngest of 5, so she had the luxury of being an artist, is how she put it. And she talks about, oh, she was like involved with the like drama society, and then whenever she graduated, she did professional acting for 6 months, and then she like joined she worked for RTE for a few years, And it's all very much like a building of a career. And then she talks about how she had burnout, and I think that's something that's very interesting to think about, because there's a lot of people that I follow and online, and a lot of creators that I would like watch stuff for like guilty pleasure almost. I've talked about burnout a lot, and they're like, the cure to burnout is self-care, and you just need to make sure that you're like looking after yourself. And like, yes, but whenever and Enright talked about burnout, she talked about it as a very real thing, as in she was asked what it looked like for her, and she said, I remember sitting on a bed and not knowing how to find the energy to button up my shirt in the morning. And she was institutionalized, and she doesn't know how many weeks she was in. She knew she was in there for weeks, but time became this like sort of conceptual concept. Like, she wasn't able to like hold on to it. She was sucked dry of energy, and that was because she'd like just been working nonstop in the entertainment industry and the media, and that those industries do just like sort of keep you going. So it's funny, I was like in the bath thinking about like how tired I am going into this semester, like, oh gosh, this is my future maybe. But I think, and she then talked about it after or before, I can't remember, it doesn't really matter anyway, but she talked about going and doing a writing course, and in doing the writing course, like not being able to write anything at all. Like, she went away to do it, and she just like couldn't write anything, and she was like, oh well, I guess I don't do this. And then came home and wrote 3 short stories which got published by Faber, and like just like, so I guess what I'm saying in all this is listening to other writers talk about writing, and other writers talk about being bad at writing and not being able to write, and not finding the right words, or not being interested in what they have to say, is still interesting and is still part of the process, I think, because if you're constantly putting stuff out, you're not taking anything in. And I think consuming is as important for writing as actually writing. So I think reading other people's work, watching films, listening to podcasts, reading plays, watching bad YouTube videos, listening to comedy, like all these things that we aren't able to interact with people who are the most interesting things that we could possibly write about, and people's relationship with everything around us. But we can sort of deal with the pieces of people that are put into all these other things. And in consuming that, we might have to consume for a little bit longer in order to get enough fullness in order to empty yourself out and write again. So in answer to that, yes, I'm also having a dry spell.
Cool. That's cool.
So, like, also, again, that was amazing. But I just want to say, the way you described that just made me think, you know, the way we need other people. It's like we're all pouring a little bit of ourselves into each other's cups, you know, it's about filling each other up. Nice.
Which is a horrible thing to think about in a COVID setting.
Disgusting, you're right.
Yeah. I think I remember this time last year, I felt literally full of like media and thoughts, like that I had consumed so much that all I had to do was sit here and just like pour it out, and it was really easy. And now I feel the exact opposite, that like it's like an empty bucket, an empty cauldron, and if anything comes, I'll like scoop it up instantly. And it's too, you know, it's actually, maybe just leave it, maybe just like let it fill up for a couple of weeks and see how you get on. Yeah. So I think the verb like to consume is so spot on.
I noticed today that you used a phrase I'd incorporated recently, and I was, obviously, very flattered. It actually made me reconsider myself for a moment and recognize that maybe I'm at least on some level heard, which is nice to know now. I'm recognized, on board and regarded, often even parroted apparently. Thought narcissistically so though. I know. Or then again, perhaps I intruded. I'm sorry. I entered your mind without wiping my feet and then tracked in some mud for the rug. Perhaps it's the worst part of ourselves that we wipe off on each other, eh? That we smear across our consciousnesses for the sake of validation, for recognition, and possibly even for survival. It may be all we've got to give. It might even be that when we are attempting a good-naturedness, or when we think we are instead just encouraging repetition, a mimicry we describe as character. Who we are instead becomes who we came from. There's nothing left of us in that case. There's nothing of who we are that isn't someone else's muck, a careless mistake, or one made with care and intent that, while good-natured, was still disturbed and disturbing. We are not ourselves then, and never were, but, instead, each other. We'll return to that someday, I think. But still, I have to ask, where is it that we turn for solace when it's not the dead that haunt us, but the living? I remember, not that long ago, when I was old. Well, older, like it was yesterday. Although I know all too soon it is going to be tomorrow. Tomorrow, when, if I'm lucky, I'll have a litter at my feet, looking at me to play some sort of game that we've devised together. Or rather one that they've devised and that I succumb to despite knowing the way my knees will feel it in the morning. Tomorrow, when the game will end and dinner will be ready. It'll have been your turn to cook because I made the Sunday dinner for everyone when they came round, and you'll have made something delicious and warm, and we'll sip on white wine, and while the flavour melts on my tongue, I'll simply melt into you. Tomorrow, when maybe if we're both very lucky, we won't have to struggle. All of that will be behind us and we can finally relax. You will have been right, as always you have been, for believing in me. Despite my incessance that you're a dozy cow forever wanting to bother. Tomorrow, when the kids are asleep and it's only the two of us left awake, when I will simply gaze into you, seeing finally on the surface what I always knew had lain beneath. I will know I've always been right about that spark in you that lights a fire in me, and I won't need to say I told you so because you hate it when I do, but still, you'll know I'm right too. And then the next day, the next tomorrow, after an evening in each other's arms in front of the fire, I'll wake up to you. We'll still be setting the alarm early so that those few minutes before dawn are only for us, and we can pretend that the dark outside is the night, when responsibilities are waiting for the dawn before they start dogging at our heels. I remember that love, that old, unknowable love, the kind that cathedrals are built on and torn down by, the kind we never believed in and revolted against in the anxieties of our youth, the kind that even now, as I sit and remember a time I long to see just once in my life, I can feel, just moments away, coming, maybe tomorrow. Morning breath blows past lips to meet my cheek, stirring me in our oft-shared bed. For weeks left with unruly sheets, there's nowhere else I'd rest my head. Eyes meet first, then arms entangle, as we joke, then fake outrage, in hopes the other tries to wrangle us back inside our boundless cage. And on days when mind is black and hope recedes, these moments knit together, to tether me once more to my bowed mattress with you, where acts are deeds, where I can feel your skin and your heart at my core. You know I'm often trodden down and fogged with thoughts of doom and death, yet all these thoughts resign themselves as I love you and your morning breath.
Field already set, beds raised from old beds. Lie down for a week, country hospital. It doesn't rain in quarantine, but everyone cries. No focus or shape or meaning no more. Trees think spring, but with caution. Somewhere near or far gasps death. Anxiety's endemic, but now it's gone viral. Desire retrenched by fear and survival, like a new lens that shatters the old. It's like an unpredictable accordion, clamps beyond perception and a furnace of sweaty heartbeats. It's like waiting for Godot and discovering that he's already here and he's serious. Well, mildly, but no one believes anyway. Most people are prisoners while I lounge in a country estate. With any luck, I'll get gilt-edged survivor's guilt.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much for watching this live stream. If you want to get involved with our little group, you're very welcome to. I say this at the end of every video, but we're fully open and just shoot a message. Please, if you enjoy the stuff, donate to our coffee page, because last time some people did, and it was really nice to get paid for writing and reading. That was nice. That's never happened before.
Thank you to the people who did.
Yeah, and please do it again. But yeah, I'll let everyone else say goodbye as well, so that it's not just me.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for
Bye.
watching.
Thank
Bye
you.
all.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao. Lots of love.
When I'm arrested, they'll call me a traditionalist that formed an early obsession with reminiscent material under the eyes of a reactionary father, and to be completely honest with you, they will be right. I have always loved nature. It began with a hardback book my father brought home from the riverbed market, a rarity sold by an antiques dealer near the bank, all dog-eared and once beloved. We spent the afternoon turning through its odd archaic pages, lingering on every illustration of a leaf or a flower, each with their own vibrancy despite the fading ink. He told me once, through stifled laughter, that it was the only time I'd ever sat still. I remember, though he seemed to forget, that he always wanted to turn the pages first, much to my dismay, of course. Don't get me wrong, he was interested in them. Who wouldn't be? But the trees, bushes, flowers, petals, they were not so much an oddity for him as they were for me. He'd been alive, for a short while at least, before the floods and the fires were finished, before their embers were quenched by the tide. Sitting me on his lap that evening, he told tales of how leaves would have grown and then fallen from trees, littering the ground and crunching underfoot, and that not only had these things been in every corner of your eye in every second of your day, but that in fact we were reading from their remnants. An obsession bloomed then and there in that rigid, inked carcass. 15 years later, I was appointed director of the nation's own nursery. I was on Westminster Bridge when I was told, standing right near the palace, a pale, limp light pouring through its Gothic panes and diffusing into the smog. Sickly rain was spitting against my waterproof, the sound like a distant percussion. The acid proofing was expensive, but it's always worth the price. The smell, that acrid smell of sulphur, permeated everything. We've never bothered trying to hide it. My comm collar rang, silencing the rain and footfall. I dusted the flaky paint off my hands onto the shoppers below me and answered. Dr. Solmite? I recognised the voice from the interview, somewhat meek but otherwise clear and direct. Speaking? My stomach trembled. We would like to formally offer you the position of director at the nation's own nursery. She sounded both proud and relieved. Congratulations. We'll see you tomorrow. I accepted, obviously. It should have been an honour. If you're one of the few who still reads state media, you might have seen the headline, Youngest Director of NON Appointed. That was me. I thought that I'd finally made it. I was ecstatic. I couldn't wait to see a natural wonder. But I never did. They'll call me an ingrate for that, and say that I was radicalised in youth by an obsession with extremist material. You see it all the time in headlines. But to their credit, this is also at least in part true. My father would jostle through the Thames on a near daily basis and return with whatever he could find related to plant life. Books were just as uncommon then, most having been digitised and burned for fuel in the harshest of times, and while the one we did have was a prideful possession, it was secreted away from the eyes of guests in a kitchen drawer for safekeeping. Our only other room was, however, strewn with our obsession, the trophies of my father's hunt. Terror sheets, for example, lay everywhere, some in boxes, some on the floor, and some remained unfurled for days on our multi-purpose table, demanding an audience for the nature they contained. I would spend hours in their bush, weeding out the beauty hidden in their multitude. It was my father's idea to decorate the place with them. The hours we spent tacking and taping those crystalline sheets to our once white walls were some of the happiest of my life. We swiped through each one to find the best images, our favourites by way of vote. Oak, sycamore, rhododendron and chrysanthemum, pine and orchid all then littered that little room. Once finished, you couldn't see the wall for the trees. A few years later, Dad struck gold under the Millennium Bridge. In one technology stall or another, he found a small trunk's worth of nodes, an extinct and expensive attempt at VR from late the previous century, perhaps 100 in total. We spent weeks combing through them. After strapping on our haptic collars, which gave a short prick to the base of our skull, we perused through one experience after the other, some rather unsavoury, scouring world after world for any hint of foliage. Finally, after hours of the 21st century in war and Royal Cruise International, the Great British Isles, we found our grail, dust-ridden and stickerless at the bottom of the trunk. The Forest of Dean. 36 square kilometres of wilderness digitised for the purposes of ecotherapy. Once we caught sight of disaster, the species scrambled, battened down the hatches, and fought desperately for necessities and little luxuries. One man, however, armed with only a small flock of drones and dogs, wandered through the now submerged forest to preserve its memory, believing, as I do now, that we would miss more than anything its serenity. I regret not looking him up while I had the chance. He seemed a good man. He would have been long dead even in my childhood, but worthy of being remembered, I think. So much of what is not. Luckily, the node still worked. From our flat 6 stories up, besieged by that damned smog with a view of only the packed street below and the windowless concrete opposite, my father and I would meander through trodden paths and rabbit trails amongst the peace of wild things. It must have taken years. Each tree, each bush, each daisy and buttercup were rendered perfectly, down to their very smell. The leaves of every tree, whether birch, beech, alder, or buckthorn, were a law unto themselves, careening and swooning in every breath of wind. They crunched underfoot as was promised. Taking one between my fingers, I could feel their waxy surface strung taut between rigid arteries, and trace my finger along the border of their myriad shapes. I will miss them. Often, my father and I would walk together in silence, eavesdropping on the branches as they moaned about the breeze of a constant summer. The city's intrusions, The horns, the yells, the screeches and sirens all evaporated here and were replaced by the chirping and creaking of wilderness. Our own silent kingdom, refuge from the world outside that berates for the sake of itself. My mind could be blank, be at peace, be removed from that bustling city without that creates one within. Despite the space, the scenery, the promise of endless discovery, nothing was ever demanded of me there. Instead, I was permitted to be still, to be wild, to just be. You have to understand that for me, this was all but hallucinatory, psychedelic even. I stood amongst monoliths sprung from the very earth, each untamed and yet rooted in place, colonizing the sky first with trunk, then branch, and finally with canopy. Our concrete jungles pale in comparison. When light broke through those dancing leaves, it was golden, gilding every thicket, thorn, and flower on the forest floor. I wept more than once at the mere sight. Sometimes I weep at the memory. But those tears only clouded my view. They steamed up the glasses I forgot were on my nose, so I'd remove them, wipe away the tears, and readjust, for longer than I would care to admit, to being back in those four walls, with that same view. I supplemented my education, if you can call it that, with textbooks and encyclopedias that I downloaded illegally from the internet and stored on an old tablet safe from prying eyes. The Mental Health and Resiliency Act had been recently enacted, but already there were ways of accessing reminiscent material, even for a child like me. I'd have done anything to see the old world. It's much more inviting than our current one. If you get the chance, read as much of it as you can. It's worth the risk. Trust me. Anyway, after years of this secret study, I applied to the Historical Institute of Terran Biology to formally specialise in all that was once living, now dead. While only recently opened, it was already somewhat prestigious, and I, caught in its prestige, I suppose, thought naively that some of the forest's peace could be found behind its wrought iron doors. While it's true that some projects do attempt to develop plants capable of growing once more on the surface, they do so with a minute supply of living genetic material. It's a noble pursuit. However, the Institute's primary purpose, though rarely publicised, is and always was the preservation of knowledge for future generations. Or, perhaps more honestly, whatever happens to find our ruins. In either case, they would know that we had been here. They'd know what we had been, and they'd know that we knew it too. Over the years there, I attempted to express my fascination with the natural world to fellow students. I figured that there had to be at least one like-minded person in a place like that, but perhaps it was my own fault, my own awkwardness or intensity that did it, because every time I tried, I was greeted with an air of polite passivity, like I was a drunk, persisting with another unwanted tale. I remember once, actually, while glancing at archived photographs, turning to my friend Owen, well, acquaintance really, and saying, "Look at what we did to Hyde Park. Can you believe it used to look like this?" "It's very green," he said, taking the photograph. "It's insane." His face contorted as he left a long, pregnant pause, considering probably how best to deal with me, and then answered indifferently, "It is what it is." Then he left. The others felt the same as he did. All were there to change the world, but only in the ways that the world would allow. So I kept to myself after that. Instead, I read alone during sociable hours, mostly nature poetry or whatever I managed to sneak out of the archives. And after 4 years of studying, my head in the forest as much as the files, I graduated near the top of my class in nativist plant species, with a minor in propagation and nourishment. Most went into pharmaceuticals, hoping to squeeze out a living wage. The rest remained at the Institute, logging archives below ground. I, instead, returned home to live with my father. Our walks in the wild became strolls along trails, which then became hobbles on path. Eventually, we took to just sitting together on the grass, feeling each blade graze each palm. He'd always sit with me and listen to my ramblings about one species or another, but I think he was just being polite. Paternal, you know. I think he began to pull away, to spare me disappointment. After months of searching for a job I thought might never come, Going as far to check the French and German enclave listings, I heard from an old professor that the NON was looking for a new director. I'd heard of this place before, obviously, but only ever from those sleek advertisements in Soho or what remained of Chelsea. There were rumours at the Institute, too, that the more well-funded projects would sometimes purchase material from them at extortionate prices, which were then supposedly kept private. I knew it might be my only chance to see real, live nature, but still, I tried not to get my hopes up. I applied, and after an application letter and short interview, I was surprisingly accepted. God, I was overjoyed. I remember the first day well. It was a disaster. I mean, it was a cordial affair, don't get me wrong. I was greeted at reception by a member of the board who led me through into a lounge plush with leather sofas, oak tables, and crystal champagne flutes. Pure luxury. Aluminum ply with matte black lettering decried welcome director and was pulled taut between two suspensors a few metres above the ground. The epitome of modern aestheticism. After pleasantries were exchanged, more so between themselves than me, all but one of the board members left, leaving me alone with Professor Ern Rickles, the largest individual shareholder. "A pleasure to finally meet you, Dr. Might. I'm delighted to have you on board," he said while firmly gripping my right hand. "Do you have any questions, any worries or concerns before we begin the tour?" "My only real concern, sir, is for the trees," I said. "Ah, no, not to worry. There's no need to concern yourself with them." I thought he misunderstood me, but his meaning became immediately clear. He led me out of the lounge, underneath that garish banner, and through a set of automatic ornately grooved oak doors. Past them lay a revolving door which descended very gradually into the city's bowels for what felt to me like miles. Finally, at its end was a narrow, porcelain-white corridor, which allowed no more than two abreast, lit from above and below by panels of quartz glass. At its end lay the nursery. Here it is, our pride and joy. Between floor tiles of gleaming porcelain, stretching out before me in countless parallel rows, were undeniably plants. The trees were by far the most noticeable, each at an identical height, standing stationary in the warehouse's clinical lighting. They tapered off with distance like the columns of a ruined temple. I searched frantically for any break from the monotony, found none. All that could be said to be satisfying was the perfectly spherical shape of the treetops, like lollipops for plucking. In the middle of each square, the corners formed by 4 separate trees sat squat, meagre bushes, pruned to obscenity. Each and every living thing here was separated from one another by that clinical white void of porcelain, and permitted only a patch of soil 4 by 4 feet in which to grow. "Splendid, isn't it?" said Ern, turning to me with a grin. He must have thought me impressed. Behind me, on the wall to which the corridor adjoined, were stacked right to the ceiling innumerable black pyramids, tessellating to form a reflective surface. I remember one detaching, descending to head height and floating languidly away from the two of us along the natural corridor of oak. It startled me as it came into view, but the professor reassured me, asking me to simply watch it hover over a plumage of chrysanthemum, sprout its grotesque bouquet of spindly metallic fingers, and begin cutting away that which it deemed unnecessary. The cuttings fell to the floor and were incinerated on impact. I choked back tears. I asked the professor to leave, which he promised he would do only after he showed me my office. This room, which sits above the whole wretched affair, is reached by a staircase in a state of disrepair. It amounts to no more than 10 metres by 8, with a large bay window overlooking the nursery. Beneath that lies a workstation, dotted with an array of grime-laden plastic buttons from which I was promised control of the entire operation. I was assured, however, that I would never need it, and that those miraculous little drones would take care of everything, including delivery. Hurriedly, perhaps seeing the horror on my face, he left without shaking my hand. For the first few months I didn't dare leave that office. I spent my days there, watching through plexiglass as the drones, detecting the slightest imperfection, detached from their monochrome wall and corrected to specification. There were times when, if they came too close, I had to look away. I realised rather early on that my title of director really meant caretaker, but they paid well nonetheless. I distracted myself from the onslaught with whatever I could find to read, but it amounted to nothing more than antiquated repair manuals and catalogues which listed the plants as products along with their price tags. Like clockwork, every 2 weeks, which is all the time it took to grow the most popular product, oak, the plants were sheathed from below by a polished sleeve of black metal and retracted into the porcelain void. Then they were delivered to the registered address, either in orbit or elsewhere. And all I could do was watch. I never knew where they were headed, who had bought them, or even who could possibly afford them. I didn't want to. I could never bring myself to tell my dad the truth. I feigned excitement for the first few weeks, describing the plant's health, the variety, the number of seeds that were kept in the germ store, and so on. Once I even managed to bring him a leaf, and he loved it, but I think he knew. I think he always knew. It wasn't long before he started asking, "How was work?" And I started replying, "It is what it is." We took one final walk through the forest. I helped him to his feet and held his arm while we shuffled through a clearing. He reached up to pluck a leaf with his right hand and caressed it with thumb and forefinger until we sat down on a wayward bench. There, he took my hand, rested his head on my shoulder, and took in the wilderness one final time before drifting off to sleep. I suffered a cloudy view. The next morning he was dead. There was nothing left unsaid. I loved him and he loved me, we both knew it, but death, grief, can make everything seem undone. He was cremated the next afternoon. They'll say this is why I did it, some form of revenge for the death of my father, whose life I've deemed to be less than he deserved, that in grief I finally broke. Here, they would be wrong. After my father died, the nursery became a non-entity. I continued going to work, but I was no longer depressed by those impressions of nature. I'd lost too much to care. I could stroll along the rows of that preternatural forest, hearing only the solid thunk of my boots on pristine tile, and feel nothing. The vaulted ceiling above, strewn with fluorescent lights, offered no warmth, no golden light to gild. The sky here is a white of threatening brilliance. Yesterday, I absent-mindedly plucked an oak leaf. Taking it between my fingers, I felt that same waxy skin strung taut between rigid veins, and, momentarily, I was satisfied, reassured that some peace might still be found. I dared, though, to touch another, and it was, in every possible way, identical. Its grooves and gorges matched perfectly the other. My fingers found no surprise. And another, from another tree, again identical. I panicked then. I ran. I was trapped down there in that ordered madness, screaming and ranting and stamping the floor, but my efforts only echoed amongst those things. Not trees, not plants, only virtually so. I cried then too, but the tears just fell. This is my confession. On August 9th, 2178, I, Dr. Soul Might, sabotaged the nation's own nursery. I feel no remorse. I took control and ordered every drone to plant as many seeds and saplings as possible in what little soil lies at the base of each plant. They swarm now, filling the air with a gentle hum. It's the first time this place has ever felt alive. I've erased all future delivery information and input coordinates for peaks I hope might still have soil viable for growth. I've also scheduled a complete erasure of the nursery's data in the hopes that their location is never discovered. Finally, I took my father's urn under one arm and strolled amongst those once wild things, scattering a handful of ash amongst the roots. My hands, as I type, are still covered in him. Once the drones retire, I'll attach this file to each transport, along with as many items of reminiscent material as possible, and activate delivery. In unison, those black cigar-shaped cylinders will emerge and engulf the would-be forest. With a final, vacuous gasp, all will be sucked beneath the void, leaving only me and an empty urn. I think I will take the long way home tonight, through the market, and go for a walk in our forest, if I get the time. Undoubtedly I will never see what I've done, nor for that matter the light of day again, but it's okay. I'm finished here. I find solace in the hope that those peaks, scorched from above and salted from below, might provide a freedom to the confined. Remember that while we have made this world as ash, ash is fertile loam. I pray they should be wild once more.